Good afternoon, everybody. This is John Wheeler with ITG. We're going to give it just one moment and then we'll get started. So just give us a minute. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. As I said, this is John Wheeler with ITG. I'd like to welcome you to the first of a series of webinars that we will be conducting over the next several months. As I said, I am a senior business process improvement consultant here with ITG. I've been with the company for a little over 4 years now, and primary focus has been on CMMI. And today we're going to do an overview of sort of the new model. As most of you all might be aware, back in March of this year, the CMMI Institute released a new version, 2.0. And today, for the next 30 or 45 minutes, I'd like to walk you through some of what those changes are, some of the nuances of it, as well as some things that we have been investigating, some best practices and things to take into consideration going forward if you all are planning on looking at the implementation of the new model. We have this webinar set up so that if you'll notice down in the toolbar on the right, you do have the ability to ask questions. What I'd like to ask is that at the end of this session, we will be having a Q&A or a period of time for Q&A, and we will address questions at that time. If we don't have an opportunity to get to all of the questions, what we are doing is recording all of the questions, and then we will follow behind and submit to all participants of this webinar with answers to those questions that were asked. Okay, so let's get started. So as I mentioned today, the webinar is going to cover just some specific areas. So basically just an introduction of the new model. So an overview, some of the new classifications, definitions that are being used, as well as a look into the new practice areas. And we'll talk a little bit about that. The maturity levels, what's new. You'll notice as we're going through this that there's going to be some familiarity with the practice areas. And also some just considerations going forward with implementation based off the new model and how it's being set up. There are some things to consider that based upon the level of maturity that you're going after, you might not have considered before under the old model. Okay, and then I'll do a little conclusion, and then like I said, we'll have a short Q&A session. Okay. So introduction. So as I mentioned, the CMMI for development is the model that is out now. It was released back in March of this year, and it does bring into new definitions, some strategic changes, both to the methodology as well as to definitions of practice. There is still some similarity with historically with the standard. What was referred to in the past as process areas are now referred to as practice areas, and there is still some overlap in all of that. New terminology. In the old model, if those of you who have participated in and worked on introducing or implementing CMMI, you're familiar with specific practices, specific goals, general practices, or generic goals and generic practices. Well, all of that really is gone now. okay? CMMI Institute with a new model has implemented a structure that is referenced, and we'll walk through this here in a second, but is referencing more along the lines of a category, and within a category are capability areas, and within those capability areas are practice areas, okay? At level 3, so the model still stands the way the old model does as far as levels of maturity, the level 2, level 3, level 4, and level 5. At level 3 in the new model, all 20 practice areas are introduced. Now, historically, in version 1.3, you might be familiar with at level 2, there were 7 process areas. At level 3, there were 18 process areas, and at level 4 and level 5, all 22 defined process areas within the model were defined or were implemented. Under the new model, at level 2, there are 10 practice areas. At level 3, there are 20, and at level 4 and 5, those 20 are still the same. So by the time you get to level 3, the overall structure of the model, the practice areas have all been introduced. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute as we walk through the model, but just to give you sort of a highlight of that, okay? Another thing with the model, the new model, is that in comparison to the old one, the generic practices don't stand alone, they're gone, okay? The GP 2.1 through 2.10 at level 2, and then the GP 3.1 and 3.2 in the old model do not stand out as separate unique requirements across all process areas, but those practices, those requirements have been folded in to various practice areas within the model, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. Really what the model is doing, in my opinion, and what the CMMI Institute has been preaching, is aligning, the new model is aligning towards more of real world applicability for business, okay? How business objectives and the strategic goals of an organization, the model is trying to line up with that a lot more efficiently, okay? And we'll talk also a little bit as well is that the new model as well has gone to, and the CMMI Institute has gone to great lengths to show the application of the dev model in various life cycle, development life cycle methodologies, particularly Agile, okay? If some of you have already had the chance to go and look at the model viewer, or purchase the model viewer and have started looking through it, you'll notice, or you'll start to notice, that there is a lot of explanation of application of the model in an Agile environment. And they're going to continue to evolve that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well, okay? So, as I mentioned before, there are 4 categories, and those 4 categories are called doing, managing, enabling, and improving. And within each category lie 3 capability areas, okay? And within those capability areas, there are specific practice areas, or what we would historically refer to in the old model as the process areas, okay? So for doing, and we're going to walk through each one of these individually, but for doing, there are 3 capability areas: ensuring quality, engineering and developing products, and selecting and managing suppliers. Now, within each one of those, for example, ensuring quality, there are the practice areas of requirements development management, process quality assurance, verification and validation, and peer review. And we're going to talk a little bit more, I keep pushing things down to other slides, but we're going to talk a little bit more about some of these process areas or practice areas in a minute. So I just want to show you the structure of the new model first and foremost, okay? So what the Institute is doing, what the model is doing here is, for example, ensuring quality. They're really starting to drive to look at the development and managing of high quality requirements and products within an organization, supporting that initiative. For engineering and developing products, it's looking at and supporting the organization's role in creating products that meet or exceed customers' expectations. Okay, and with supplier or selecting and managing suppliers, it's how are we going about minimizing supply chain risks, okay, and how are we managing our suppliers, our vendors, our subcontractors as such, okay. The next category is managing, okay, and managing breaks down into, again, 3 capability areas: planning and managing work, managing business resilience, and managing the workforce, okay. Planning and managing work has practice areas that are estimating, planning, and monitoring and control. Managing business resilience is risk and opportunity management. Managing the workforce is breaking out how we organizational training as a practice area, okay? So planning and managing work. The focus of these process areas are going to fall into how we optimize schedules, how we optimize the planning of work, and make sure that we reduce our issues and our ability to time to market. So looking for more efficient ways and more effective and leaner practices to deliver to market. Managing business resilience. The focus there is anticipating and adapting to the disruptions and the opportunities that have the ability to improve or impact work or the business objectives of the organization. Managing the workforce. How are we effectively training and maintaining staff productivity? Okay. The next 2 I'm bringing together, but we'll talk about each category separately. So the first one, enabling. Within that is supporting implementation. Now you'll say to yourself, because John, you just told us that there were 3 in each one. Right now, there is 1 in enabling, supporting implementation, but we'll come back to that now in a minute. And there are 2 in improving, okay? So within those, supporting implementation, the practice areas focus on causal analysis and resolution, decision analysis and resolution, and configuration management. Some of those might be familiar to you already. Within improving, we have building and sustaining capability and improving performance. Within building and sustaining capability, we have the practice areas of governance and implementation infrastructure. Within improving performance capability area, we have process management, process asset development, and managing performance and measurement practice areas. So supporting implementation. The focus there is ensuring that product integrity and stakeholder buy-in is there, and making sure that the solutions and the approach that we have is the most efficient and effective and controlled way of doing our delivery, okay? In improving, with building and sustaining capability, we're looking for the way that we can sustain process efficiency and performance. And with improving performance, we're looking at the way to establish, track, and measure the performance of the organization so that we're making sure that our goals are aligning with our business needs, okay? So, I mentioned to you before that right now, or I said that, most of these have 3 capability areas for each category. Well, that's not exactly true right now. Okay, so right now, as I've read to you, or we've gone through already, that doing has 3, managing has 3, enabling has 1, and improving has 2. The way the Institute is implementing this model, and it's a little bit different than they've done in the past, is that the model will have the capability to evolve, and new content will come in further releases over the months and years to come. So you'll look at this right now. Right now we have 4 categories, and we have 9 capability areas. But some of the areas that we know are coming, for example, that the CMMI Institute has already started to talk about is, for example, under enabling, you'll see managing safety and managing security. So there are some future growth opportunities with the model in the various in the various capability areas, as well as the practice areas that follow. But I'm not going to speculate on that, what they'll include. There still is some discussion going on within the Institute and its partners on the best way that will happen, when it does happen, how it'll be managed, how it'll be implemented, and what it means to organizations that are already have any level of maturity rating already, or are in the process of getting ready for an assessment. And you certainly can, and we will continue to work with all of you in the months and years that come to manage that in the best way possible. So I talked a little bit already about a practice area. So I'm primarily going to be talking today at level 3, so that we have all 20 practice areas involved. But we have a couple slides coming up where I'll sort of break some of that out, and you can understand what that means. But a practice area in reference is really historically what in the old model was a process area. And depending on, at level 3, for example, the maturity level that I'm looking to implement that particular practice area, there are requirements up to that practice area. So for example, and I'll use configuration management for as example, or no, better yet, let's use planning. Okay. So for planning, if I was just doing level 2, or I wanted to implement that practice area at a level 2, there would be a series of requirements that are dictated and demonstrate up to a level 2 maturity. If I was going to do level 3 for planning, there would be some additional requirements that bring me up to the model's definition of a maturity level 3. And it goes on for level 4, and it goes on for level 5. So each practice area has its own unique requirements for a particular level. That's a little bit different than the old model. For example, going back to the example I gave before, in version 1.3, at level 2, there were only 7 process areas. And then at level 3, there was 18. So that was an additional 11. So there were things that I wasn't necessarily having to address at level 2, where in the new model, some of these practice areas are introduced a lot more quickly. Okay. Sorry, I was just trying to turn something on here. It didn't work. So here are the maturity levels. Very straightforward, much like it was in the past. There's not a whole lot of difference to that. They just focus basically on, manage, define, And then level 4 and level 5 is going to be your high maturity. So really no change there. So at level, what's new? So at level 2, there are 10 practice areas. Okay, configuration management, estimating, governance, implementation infrastructure, managing performance and measurement, monitoring and control, planning, process quality assurance, requirements development and management, and supplier agreement management. At level 3, those 10 original at level 2 are still there. Plus we add causal analysis and resolution, decision analysis and resolution, organizational training, peer review, process asset development, process management, product integration, risk and opportunity management, technical solution, and verification and validation. And we'll talk about some of these in the next slides. So the new practice areas, the ones that are really stand out are, there are about 4 or 5. The first one being governance, the second one being implementation infrastructure. Governance and implementation infrastructure really are looking at the roles of how the organization and the stakeholders, senior management, and how processes are developed, how they are brought into the organization. Now, typically, or historically, I should say, the governance requirements in the new model, for all intents and purposes, tie back to what was historically in version 1.3 as organizational process definition and organizational process focus. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. With implementation infrastructure, it's how we ensure that the processes that we're developing are relevant and important to the organization, how they're used, and how we improve on those areas. These were historically tied to these new requirements. For all intents and purposes, were historically reached back to the generic practices under version 1.3. Excuse me. 2 other new practice areas are process asset management and process management. And these really just boil down to, again, how you go about with the development of process, how you manage process assets, and how we implement and continuously improve. And again, these are being tied back to, for process asset management, is more tying back to historical requirements for organizational process definition, and process management is tying back to organizational process focus. Now, I don't want to misconstrue and say this is a 1-for-1 correlation to some requirement, verbatim in the old model, because it is not true, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second as well. Another 2 new practice areas is estimating and peer review. Now, estimating, if you guys are familiar with the old model and project planning, there was a specific requirement that within project planning that was focusing on how we establish estimates of work. In the new model, that has actually been broken out into its own process or practice area, excuse me. And now it's a little bit more robust with specific requirements on how we establish, or first of all, how we do estimation, but establishing the rationale, strategy, and the approach that we want groups to use, whether it's a project or an organizational group, to how you estimate for budgeting, cost, work, level of effort, those types of things. The other element or new practice area is peer review. You also might be, again, familiar with the fact that in the old model under verification, this was a specific requirement under verification. They've now moved it out and turned it into its own practice area as well. And it's a little bit more robust with additional requirements for conducting peer reviews and analyzing peer reviews, but applying it to a much broader scope instead of just within a testing environment, usually defined by verification or the verification practice, but looking for opportunities to apply it in a much broader scope, document creation or any type of other work products that we might be developing and getting ready to deliver to the customer. Aside from those, the remaining practices, and you've seen some of them, or you've seen them already as we were highlighting the practice areas before, you'll see that a lot of them are familiar already. Planning was the old project planning in version 1.3. Monitoring and control was the old project monitoring and control. Managing performance and measurement basically is the measurement and analysis practice area or process area from version 1.3. Now I will add some clarification to that, is they are not the exact requirements. It's not a copy and paste from version 1.3 to 2.0. The requirements have evolved. They're more strategically defined to align, like I said before, to align with business objectives and the business approach of organizations. In my opinion, and most of my colleagues, it's become a little bit more user-friendly to application in a business environment and a lot less CMMI speak. And some of the difficulties that tended to have in the past. Now, there is one additional practice area which was always there in CMMI version 1.3, which was causal analysis and resolution. However, it's unfamiliar to most of us because those of us that in organizations that don't go after a high maturity, i.e. level 4 or level 5, would never have been introduced to this process area in the old model. In the new model, causal analysis and resolution does come into play. Now that doesn't mean that we need to operate at high maturity or under the conditions of high maturity with scientific or quantitative analysis, but it does start to bring in some of the requirements for how we conduct and manage sort of root cause practices to look at and help make sure that the reoccurrence of identified issues, whatever those issues might be, and whatever we choose how to apply this, whatever they might be, how we can go do analysis to prevent and look at what the true issue or the true reason of these things are happening, why these things are happening, and implement solutions that address the root instead of what we might think is the issue. And that really in a nutshell, and I'm handling this at a very high level. It's much more involved requirement wise, but causal analysis and resolution for the most part is just looking at that. And at level 3, that's as far as it will go as a root cause practice. The practice areas that probably are more familiar to you are using the same terminology: configuration management, decision analysis and resolution, organizational training. I put in here process quality assurance. That's the old PPQA, process and product quality assurance. It's now just called process quality assurance. Product integration, requirements development management, risk and opportunity management, supplier agreement, technical solution, and verification and validation. Now what's interesting, and this is important also at a level 2, for example, and I'll give you a scenario. For requirements development and management, which is the new practice area and model in version 2.0. In the old model, if I was just going after level 2, the only requirements process area that I had to worry about was requirements management. Requirements development wasn't introduced until I got to level 3, and then I had to do both requirements development and requirements management. Okay. Now in the new model, at level 2, requirements development and requirements management is there. It is one practice area. So it's not to suggest that I need to implement and demonstrate at a level 3, excuse me, at a level 3, if I'm just looking at it at level 2, but there are requirements, or there are requirements there for requirements development at level 2 in the new model that did not exist in the old model. So, and the same thing goes for verification and validation. Verification and validation now is one practice area, and I just misspoke there, and I said that it was introduced at level 2. It is not. This is a practice area that comes in at level 3 in the new model. But instead of being 2 separate practice areas as it was in the old model, in 2.0, it's one. Verification and validation is a combination of the 2. So really quickly, and I don't want to run out of time, but with the introduction of governance and implementation infrastructure, companies are going to have to start looking at how sort of senior management and organizational directives come into play for process development, implementation, and improvement at a level 2. Okay. In the old model, and we've sort of talked about this already, in the old model, in version 1.3, if I was just going after level 2, I never really had to worry about organizational process definition and focus. I didn't really have to worry about demonstrating outside of a project the implementation of how organizational directives influence and the management from seniors to process development works. That didn't start getting implemented until we were at level 3 in the old model. In the new model, version 2.0, those things are starting to come into play. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that we have to, the model's suggesting that you have to have this big quality management or process improvement group that oversees the implementation of process, but it does talk about and need to demonstrate that there needs to be some interplay with all of that. And things to consider, and we'll talk a little bit more about this here in a minute, but things to consider with that is, do projects take on that responsibility at level 2? And typically that's not always going to be the case. So again, working towards how to best implement the governance and infrastructure requirements, which start earlier in the new model, will need to be taken into consideration. And if we're working with you all on the implementation, even at level 2, these have to be conversations that we have. Okay. So here's some examples, some things that we're thinking and we believe are starting to come into play at a much earlier at level 2, and having conversations of how we establish a more strategic and managed approach in implementing and managing process. Okay, and considerations for how we plan and how we manage include things like a strategic policy, creation of a strategic policy. What are the oversight requirements? Developing strategic plans or process improvement plans. If those things are created, who owns them, or process improvement groups put in place, or responsibilities with team and organization, creation of charters to show those interaction of process in the interaction of ownership and management and communication, and how we manage improvement and change. Okay, and those things in the new model come in and are much more forward than in the old model, but I think also are much more strategically aligned with, again, back to business objectives and strategic approach of an organization, and feel those are much more a value add than typically was demonstrated in the old model. So just about wrapping up here. We got about 35, we've been going for about 40 minutes now. I want to talk a little bit here is, we've sort of gone through all this, the best practices is focused more on improvement and focusing on performance of key business objectives. The changes are more useful to alignment and adoption within a more realistic business architecture and the organization strategy than we feel it has been in the past. And certainly it's designed to support and be much more consistent with those achieving those business objectives and looking at performance within the organization and quality and a focus on cost and schedule and functionality much more than the old model did, and which tended to have more of a flavor and more of a focus just on application, I should say, application of the process. So that concludes sort of an overview of the presentation. I'd like to take a few minutes and go through. We do have some questions. So one of the things that I mentioned, I believe I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, is if you had questions, please submit them, and we'll be able to see those questions here. One of the things that we are going to do is that any questions that were asked, we will collect, and if I don't answer them here in the next 5 minutes or so, please note that we will answer all questions that we received, and then we will distribute them out. If there are any additional questions other than the ones that I have now, we'll distribute those out to the participants. Okay. So one question is, and we sort of talked about this a little bit already, but I'll talk a little bit more, is what is really required for estimating? Okay. As I mentioned before, with the new practice area, it's really calling in to play a much more defined and rational approach, or rationalization of your approach, and a strategy for how we do estimation. Okay. Now, the level of complexity of estimation can be defined by the organization. It doesn't need to be a scientific, but it can be ones where we're at least justifying and showing and demonstrating how we do estimation, and keeping that data available for future use. And that's probably more important in the new practice area than anything else. One of the things that we have already started doing is putting together guidelines for estimation and bringing out some of the industry standards, such as 3-point and wide plane Delphi and some others, and giving an understanding of how to go about doing that, and we will be training as we go. So I really think that within the new model and the new practice areas, especially with estimating, that really starts to get those practices more defined. Okay. Does senior leadership need to be involved? Was another question we got. Yes, they do, and I think also, I don't think under the old model that they didn't need to be, but in the new model, there is a much more involved, much more active role with senior management, between the projects and senior management, that needs to be demonstrated, and also from a much earlier stance for the, as we mentioned, the defining and implementing processes and the improvement practices that go around that. In the old model at level 2, as I mentioned before, those didn't really need to be demonstrated that well, other than reviewing stuff with higher level management. Now most of these practice areas are have intimate requirements that require and demonstrate the interplay of the senior management and the users of implementation of process. Okay. One question that I have received as well is, I have an upcoming appraisal, okay, and should I go for 1.3 or 2.0? So let's talk a little bit about that. So in the CMMI Institute will start accepting version 2.0 to 2.0 appraisals next year, so 2019. The current model for development, version 1.3 and 2.0, are both going to be sort of coexist, okay? Version 1.3 is not going to sunset until March of 2020, okay? So the CMMI Institute will accept an appraisal under the old model, excuse me, until March of 2020. And at any point up until that point, if you receive it, then that would be valid. That appraisal rating would be valid for 3 years. Okay, so it really is dependent on sort of what the strategic needs of the organization are. Now, I would say that if you are if midstream right now under the old model, I wouldn't just stop everything I was doing and that we were going to have the appraisal in January or February of next year. I would still say that you would continue on with the appraisal under the old model. As far as next year is concerned, I think it's dependent on sort of what your strategic needs are, but then also the consultation that we're going to have. If we're working with you, there certainly should be and will be conversations that we will have, is what's the best approach for and what makes business sense for the company. And it is like when the old model version 1.3 came out, version 1.2 and 1.3 coexisted for a period of time. And these will do the same thing. The other side of that as well is that CMMI for services, which was another one of the questions, is when will services be released? Services is not, is slated to be released later this year, so by the end of the year. So once we have that out, and they are saying that it will be out. Once that is out, then that period of transition for that clock starts as well. So we would probably be looking for CMMI for services version 1.3 to sunset sometime late 2020, and it would follow the same path as development is right now. The old model and the new model would coexist. So let's see here. I'm just seeing if I have time to get to any other questions. So I had a question is, if we were operating successfully under 1.3, will we have to make mass changes to our development process to meet 2.0? It's not necessarily making mass changes. It's not a radical abandonment of the old model with completely new requirements. Is there an evolution? Yes. Is there a demonstration is there going to be a change in demonstration of the appraisal? Yes, there is going to be a new appraisal model that comes out with this, or it is out with this. That so those of you who have gone through a CMMI for appraisal under the old model 1.3, that appraisal model and PID development and presentation of the assessment is probably going to change a little bit, and not probably, it is going to change, and how we and working with the lead assessor and how we demonstrate. To be honest, those things are still not in discussion, but I haven't been, and nor anybody outside of a lead appraiser has been fully trained on that yet. That's something that we have a schedule to do with some of the lead appraisers that we work with here in the next several weeks. And if we're fortunate enough to be working with you all in the near future, we certainly will and would allow time to make sure that that was handled accordingly. But to answer that question, I do not and have not seen anything in the new model that so has a radical change in practice. Certainly some new things. For example, the estimation, right? Estimating, that's going to be a change. It's a little bit more robust practice than was historically in the old model. Peer review, certainly a little bit more robust than it was in the old model. So there are areas like that. Yes, I think where we would see the most difference, and again, just my opinion, where I would see the most differences is if I was just level 2 in the old model and was reassessing at level 2 in the new model, there would certainly be some additional, much more, a lot more things that I would have to demonstrate and have in place, and that would be my opinion on that. Well, we've gotten just about 50 minutes in, and that was always going to be sort of the scheduled time for this. I want to thank everybody for attending. If we didn't have an opportunity to get to your question, please don't hesitate, or please don't be worried. Like I said, we are going to take all the questions, even the ones that I've rambled on about here today. We're going to encapsulate all those, get those answers together, and then we will publish and deliver these to you probably in the next week or so at the latest. Okay. So again, I want to thank everybody for participating in our first webinar. I know there were little bugs and it might not have been as smooth as we would like it to have been, but it was a pleasure. And please remember that this is the first in a series that we will be doing every month. We're typically shooting for the last Thursday of the month, depending on, of course, on holidays and such. But if you received an invitation to this, you will continue to receive invitations to our follow-on webinars. So again, thank you all very much for attending this one, and I wish you all well and have a great rest of the afternoon. Thank you.